Welcome to Roots of Faith. I'm Renee Richard, and today we continue our journey talking about the National Leprosy Hospital that existed here with Elizabeth Scheck-Snyder, curator of the museum. So join us as we explore what life was like here on the river at Carville. Elizabeth, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
You know, in last week's show, we talked about basically how this place came to be and the progression of disease, of Hansens disease, and the cure for it. But we really didn't get into what life was like for the people living, here, or for patients that had Hansens disease. So this fabulous museum that's on the grounds really covers everything. So what would it have been like in those early years, say, for a patient?
Oh, wow, that's a great question because I can tell you that, let's say the 1940s, after there was hope of leaving, as in patients knew that if they took the medical treatment that Dr. Faget had developed, that there was a hope of going back home. Well, meanwhile, the majority of their day was spent in a more social venue, not all medicine.
Right.
You can see this platform behind us has quite a few artifacts on exhibit. There was a lot of music. There actually is a upright piano on our platform. There must have been 6 or 7 pianos scattered through the grounds. There were quite a few patients in bands. They'd perform for themselves and get other musicians to come in and perform for them.
Oh, wow.
They might have picked up the latest issue of the Store magazine. Patients published their own magazine. We had patients who were involved in the production of that, actually as reporters and photographers. You can see some large format photographs on the back wall that show patients in school. We actually had a school here for young patients. Patients were allowed to run their own businesses if they had a skill. The government would help them set that up. As a matter of fact, there's a barber chair on the platform. We had a patient barber. We had a beautician, for the ladies. We had patients who ran laundries for dry cleaning. So it was a community. Anything you can think of going on in a community was probably going on here. It depends on the decade now. In the 40s and 50s, that red Cushman scooter behind you, we had a club of about 25, 30 patients with Cushman scooters, and they had access to about 300 acres of land to ride on. Yeah,
wow.
We even had a small lake in the back from the 1950s onward where patients could go fishing or have a picnic. So there were social activities. There was a 9-hole patient golf course. There were sporting competitions. Patients actually also had a softball team called the Carville Indians. Yeah. So it depends on your interest, of course, and the state of your health, because not everyone was deathly ill when they got here, and some people, as they stabilized and their health improved, they got more active. There were other clubs based on religious, either your persuasion, your religious persuasion, or your nationality of origin.
That's true, because by then now you're getting in people from other countries.
Well, the way that worked is this was a national hospital for the care and treatment of people with Hansens disease. So only if people were diagnosed within the United States did they come here. So we were taking care of our 50 states and territories. Anyone diagnosed with leprosy there, whether you're a foreign national or not, you'd come here to the National Leprosy.
I see.
Yeah. So we ended up with patients with origins in the Far East and South and Central America. Really, kind of everyone was represented here.
And it's funny because you're talking about this, and I'm thinking of a town. We have all different businesses, all the businesses you were, and this was self-contained. So
Yes, it was.
This was their world. This was their town.
It was. Now, There was a staff side of the hospital grounds and a patient side. So if you're looking at a map and you're looking at 350 acres, it's relatively a square. It would have been kind of roughly divided in half. And there really was a line where patients knew that they were not allowed to cross. Even in the 50s, that line existed. So a patient living here under quarantine in the 1940s would have had a very different life experience as maybe a staff or dependent of an employee who grew up on the grounds, which many people did. Because the U.S. Public Health Service, they were our chief doctors, but we also had a huge support staff, as you can imagine, because we had our own electric plant.
Right,
We had a
right.
water
Cooks.
treatment plant. We had cooks. But the guys who ran the big like electric and plumbing and water, they would have been here on the grounds too, because they had to be available to react to any emergency. They like to keep the chief engineers close.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of this beautiful facility, we're here in this museum, and I know that there's medical stuff too. In their day, they weren't seeing the doctors every day though, were they?
Probably not. It depended on the state of their health and where they were in their treatment plan. But the infirmary is where the doctor's offices were. The balance of the property is living and eating and recreation.
We were talking about the two different areas, but then there was functions here, I know, like dances, where if the family's allowed, you did see the employees' families or children participating in certain things. And I know there was a lot more going on here too. I know Mardi Gras Ball, because I've seen all the Mardi Gras stuff behind me. So let's talk a little bit more, because it was a community of what happened, daily around.
Well, it depends on the season and, of course, the decade that, let's see, let me tell you a little bit about when Mardi Gras picked back up after World War II, because they did pause for a few years there. The patients had, they elected a king out of the patient body, and then he selected a queen, and they had a court, and Mardi Gras was very competitive here and a big, big deal, but it was patient Mardi Gras. And it was also Carville style. That means that the floats that they built had to be narrow enough to go through the 8-foot wide hallways.
Always.
Right. So the ballroom was on the second floor of the recreation center. And I know from my photographs and from oral histories that the sisters were very involved, but also staff would help patients build things as well. It was a big, big deal. I mean, they'd plan on it for weeks and weeks and were very competitive about it. So that was an annual event that eventually the staff got involved in. As a matter of fact, I competed in the last Mardi Gras golf cart decorating contest with one of the patients named Arsenio, and we won third place.
Oh, well, that's awesome.
That was quite a while back. So that's a thing of the past now. But dances, very, very typically every major holiday, the patients would have had some activity planned. Everything was neatly fit together. As a matter of fact, the patient newspaper that I mentioned, our magazine
Star.
earlier, The Star, funded a big Christmas party every year. They were famous for the Christmas party. And they would actually get outside musicians. They'd get a small orchestra to come in and perform. So it was something that was really looked forward to. So yeah, as staff became friendly with the patients and maybe they got to know the patients, they were invited to participate. It was not so much in the early days, but a lot more later on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's step back, and I know everything revolves around what laws were passed here, but in any time frame, when someone came here, when someone was diagnosed, now they're coming here, tell us a little bit about what would happen to them before they fit into the community of Carville that exists here.
Right. Well, it had to be life-changing, no matter what decade you were diagnosed. And depending on how far away you were from home, it had to be frightening. It wasn't an easy place to get to. We were off the beaten path, even for Louisiana.
Correct.
We're 80 miles from New Orleans. not so far away from Baton Rouge, but Baton Rouge wasn't the major hub that it is today. So it was difficult for patients' families to visit them, even if they wanted to. And, but they
was gonna
were
say,
allowed.
was that allowed?
They
Okay.
were allowed. Now, up until the 50s, 60s, patients' families under the age of 16 were not allowed
Okay.
on the patient side. But I know for a fact that it happened, as in when patients' family members, for example, if you were a young mother who had children
Right.
under the age of 16 and you were a patient, I've heard from the children that they would find ways to go and visit their mother.
I think that applied to my husband's family.
Yeah, okay.
My husband's aunt was here.
Oh,
with,
okay.
With her two small daughters.
And did they come in and visit? And
they
what
did.
decade was that?
Probably in the 50s.
That they probably would have had to sneak them in.
Yeah.
And that happened, I'd say probably predictably it happened with people with small children. Sometimes actually the parents would go through the hole in the fence. If the parents were patients or one parent was a patient here, there was a hole in the fence.
Okay, I was about to say, explain, I've read about it, but explain the whole situation with the hole in the fence.
Right,
Because
now,
that's
the-
a story in and of itself.
Yeah, right, the iconic hole in the fence. Well, there were more than one holes in the fence over the decades, but let's talk about the one that, you can still see it, it's
Okay.
patched. It still exists, but it's got a patch over it now. Patients, if they had young children and they wanted to spend time with them, sometimes they'd plan a picnic. I mean, they had to get someone on the outside willing to bring the kids.
Right.
And then the parents would time it, and they'd sneak through the hole in the fence and meet them maybe on the other side of the levee and have a
Okay.
picnic lunch there. Now, that said, I have a feeling that the administration knew that was going on, and they turned a blind eye.
But there were times where people would get out and be at the bars and things like that. And if you were caught, there was actually a jail on the grounds.
There was a jail on the grounds. Now, let's back up and say that jail came into existence in the 1920s for a much more serious reason, but it was used later on, most likely because people were leaving against medical advice, leaving the grounds, or getting drunk and disorderly while they were here. So yes, we did have a jail, and
But it wasn't necessarily used if they slipped out the,
maybe it just
Yeah.
depends.
I read that
Yeah,
somewhere
it could
that-
be. Oh, definitely, it
depending
could
on
be.
what they did when they got out.
Probably so, right.
So that's just one of the quirks with the life at,
It was yeah,
Carville.
right, and there are stories about people spending time in jail for various reasons.
but you know, life here, like in anything you say, they probably closed an eye. It is isolated, but you have to deal with everything one case at a time. I mean, it's, you know.
Medical
it's-
officers in charge had a lot of leeway in how that they enforced
Is there
the
anything that's truly
policy.
black and white? You know, in today's world, living in a community, you've got gray areas. So I'm sure that
Definitely,
applied
and I'm sure there were
here.
favorites, and I'm sure there were troublemakers too.
I have with me today Mr. Austin Barb, longtime employee and resident here at the Hansen Center. So, Mr. Austin, I know we were talking earlier, your dad worked here, correct?
My dad worked here. He started here probably, well, it was in the Second World War. We didn't live here on base at the time. In 1944, we did move here on base. One of the interesting things about moving on base, if you were head of a department, which he was chief engineer in a power plant, and quarters became available, you could move on base. At that time, rent was $25 a month.
Wow.
That included utilities. Not only did it include utilities, but if you did move on base, you got a $25 a month raise.
Oh, goodness, okay.
So basically, you lived there free. And we did have all recreational facilities. We
And
had
there's-
tennis courts, golf course, ping pong room, movies 3 times a week. It's pretty convenient.
That's it. And so his capacity was at the power plant, but you went on and stayed here and became an employee here, you were telling me, for what, 31 years?
I worked here 31 years. I went to LSU, and then I realized I knew everything, so I quit and joined the Navy. I got out of the Navy in 1957. Mom and Dad were still living here. Dad hadn't retired yet, so I moved back with them. And got married in 58, so I was left out from it. Anyway, in 58, I did start to working here at Carville. So I've been here many years.
And what was your job here?
When I first worked here, I worked here as a security guard.
Okay.
Our job at that time was either at the gate or a fire watch on the patient side. If you were a fire watch on the patient side, you worked some very odd hours from 8 at night till 4 in the
Sure.
morning. And your first duty was to go to the dining room and get a wagon that was loaded with bread and milk and went to each patient dormitory and rang a little bell, and the patient would come out and get some bread and milk as a snack that evening. And when you put it back up, you'd start making rounds, punching a clock as a fire watch. It was mandatory that every patient be off of the walks at 10 o'clock at night. So that was another duty, make sure every patient was at least in his dormitory
At
by
that
10
time.
o'clock at night.
That's it. And these facilities went, for those that don't know, the facilities here for the patients, it was a self-sufficient city per se. So like you're saying, the tennis courts and all the recreational things, they were for the patients as well, but y'all had use of them.
No,
No?
there were two separate theaters.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We had a swimming pool. There was a hedgerow right down the middle of this place. The patients stayed on their side. We could go on their side, but they couldn't come on ours.
Okay.
So any facilities that we had here was double on the other side,
Okay. Interesting.
with the exception of a swimming pool. And if you go to the old swimming pool today, which is the same pool, there is an 8-foot fence. The reason for the 8-foot fence, there was a 4-foot fence, but one night one of the guards caught some patients swimming in the pool, so they put an 8-foot fence with barbed wire around the top. So basically, they had all the recreation facilities that we did.
Okay. Within this contained
Yes.
thing. You were talking about the walkways. That's one of the unique features of the physical plant here, is that those walkways were there so that even if they were wheelchair bound, they could get around.
I don't know if you're up to the facility, but there are about 2.5 miles of covered walkways here, 2 floors. There are no more screens on them, but they all were all screened in at one time.
Okay.
And yes, that was, they could get to the dining room, to the church, or anywhere else under a covered walkway.
Now, when you went to work here, did you live here?
No, I never did live on base while I worked
Okay.
here.
So you were living in the community. What was the community's perception of having a hospital for patients with Hansens disease here in Carville?
The community accepted it very much.
Okay, good.
There was no problem with Hansen disease patients here. However, if you went to Baton Rouge and said you worked at Carville, they didn't want anything to do with you for fear that you might be contagious.
That's it. Well, the early readings that I was doing too, when they first came here, that was the fear. But as I read through some of the materials, they said like when the sisters would go across the river to Donaldsonville to get something or whatever, they were brought back baskets of cakes and cookies and things for the patients here.
Absolutely.
So I got that impression that by this time, by the time you were here, the community had accepted them, and that's
They had,
How it
community
was.
had, absolutely,
very good.
absolutely. And the nuns were just exceptional people, the Daughters of Charity. They were all professional people. They were either registered nurses, pharmacists, dietitians, whatever
Yeah,
profession was
I mean, they
needed.
functioned to carry this place on.
Yes.
Every role a community has, one of
Yes.
them served as in
Absolutely.
reading, which is amazing, but just, their lifestyle and wanting it to come, coming here and knowing that they would be here. But I was listening before you and I started too. You were now I understand you saying you were in security. You knew the military, because this was a military base. This is owned by the U.S. government. So you also knew the doctors well. You knew the families of some of these military
You-
people that were here,
You've got to understand this hasn't always been a military facility.
just owned by the U.S. government.
It was owned by the government. All of our doctors and physical therapists and specialists were commissioned officers, but they were not military. They
Okay.
wore military uniforms, Navy uniforms. But they were all commissioned officers.
Okay. It was just owned by the U.S. It was a U.S.
Yes.
public service place.
U.S. Public Health Service.
Very good. Well, thank you for talking with me today. So it's been a joy to talk to someone who actually lived here and knows how this place worked from your perspective.
It's been a pleasure, and I just wish we had about 2 hours more.
I know. I could tape 6 shows on this place, no doubt. We've talked about many aspects of, the Hansen Center here. Now let's concentrate on this, what you're here to do, and that's this museum that folks shall need to come out and see. So let's talk a little bit about what you have here
Okay.
that tells their story.
Oh, a lot.
Okay,
Yes.
so I'll let
So-
you pick a spot to start.
Well,
I wouldn't even know where to begin.
right. It started, the collection in this museum started when the museum began out of a centennial celebration of the arrival of the first Daughters of Charity, and that was in 1996.
Okay.
So patients and staff started bringing artifacts together, and that's kind of where I enter after that. It was a volunteer-run museum for the first couple of years, and so I had kind of a core, and I took my cue from that. Plus, we were still doing a lot of collecting because the hospital was in the process of moving away. So
Okay.
what I'm trying to say is we have some artifacts dating back to like the turn of the 20th century, up to kind of the 1980s, 90s, when the hospital closed at this location and moved to Baton Rouge. We have cultural artifacts, we have medical artifacts, we have one whole room dedicated to the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, who played such a big role here. We have regular tours. People make plans in advance to tour, and I give them kind of an overview history using the artifacts of what happened here at this quarantine site. We have artifacts left behind by patients. Some really wanted to help tell the story. Other patients were more shy and more reserved and might not want to be spotlighted that way. So we take our cue from what the patients wanted as well.
So you will see all kinds of things here. What was this building that we're in? What was its function before it was a museum, out of curiosity?
Right, before it was built to be a staff dining hall.
This one was.
Yeah,
Okay,
this
so it's a
area
good
is
size
where.
space.
It is, and basically, most of the walls were not here. They were
Okay.
put in later on when this was retrofitted into an office space. But this was where the cooking took place, and then there were open dining areas in the front of the building. So,
So here, I know you have plenty of old photographs too. You have photographs literally from the time they began.
Pretty much, yes.
Coming forward, there's plenty of photography for you to see what life was like, how it looked.
Right.
Aerial shots of the place.
Right.
There's also, it fascinates me being a nurse, some of the medical equipment that's here, because medicine has evolved so much
Oh,
in the last 100 years. But you see, the white cabinets with the little white drawers that are so typical of the 40s and the 50s,
Right.
along with sterilization things. And there's some old x-ray machines.
we don't have an X-ray machine, it was too big.
Oh, okay.
But we do have X-rays.
Oh, okay. So that's
Reproduction of
interesting.
X-rays, and we do have some casts of patients' hands and feet. We developed a shoe shop here and a lot of medical techniques to take care of insensitive feet.
Feet, right.
So, and a lot of that technology had, and still is being used today, more for example, diabetic foot care. So a lot of our technologies are still being used. So we have some of the early modifications of tools like spoons and forks, and we have buttonhole pullers that staff made for patients with insensitive hands and maybe lack of certain fingers to help them get through a day and be self-sufficient.
That you and I take for granted.
That's correct.
So many things that we take for granted. One of the other things that I know that you have here is you have several films that people can watch about.
We do.
Both about the disease process itself. You said there were several. So what are
There-
some of the
there
other
are
things that
several.
show here?
We have, actually, if people are interested in research, I have quite an extensive oral history collection, about 100 oral histories.
Oh, how
50
amazing.
patients and about 50 of staff, dating back, I'd say, to the 1940s to the present.
Oh, how amazing.
Full of details, but people need to make an advanced
appointment.
appointment, exactly. But for students of all ages and just people with general interest or people writing books. I mean, we've had almost a book a year come out of Carville, whether it's patient-authored books, which we carry, or professional writers. So research is a big part of the museum's mission today.
I would think so, like college students, both for occupational therapy or just
History,
sociology,
English.
anthropology, yeah, or anything along those lines with what life was like, here. So I didn't realize that aspect, existed as well. The Star, I
Right.
know that you have publications.
The Star magazine actually is all online now. We
Oh,
have
how
hard
amazing.
copies,
See
right,
that?
and reproductions, but it's all digital. So when teachers contact me, when out-of-state researchers contact me, I can just send them a link and they can do their research from where they are. So we're trying to digitize as we can some of the more useful resources. I might mention that the Patient's School had their own little 4-page publication, a weekly publication
Oh,
that's
wow. And
interesting
you
as
have that
well. We
as
don't
well.
have those as digital, but if
You have them
people are
here.
interested, we have hard copies, yes.
That's amazing. So what is your favorite thing? I'm gonna put you on the spot here.
Ooh, that's tough.
Okay, give me a couple then. But tell me some of the things that fascinate you that you have
Oh,
here.
well, the Stanley Stein
that comes-
Archives, like I mentioned before, there was a kernel here, and then I built on it. I actually brought those archives over from Stanley Stein's offices. Stanley Stein started the patient magazine, The Star.
Okay, so he was a patient here.
Yes, and
Okay.
he got here in the 30s, he died in the 60s. He was the patient editor of The Star, so he had about 30
Oh.
years of paperwork. And I saved that archives, and it's fascinating.
Oh, I bet it is.
I'll never run out of new finds in that archives, even though I look at it, some part of it every, few months. So Stanley Stein Archives is definitely one of my favorite things here.
Okay, great. Now, I know y'all came when we did the St. Gabriel exhibit. Do you have any kind of special functions that y'all do at any given time
We
or
have
periodically?
regular walking tours. I developed one that I take, I'll tell you about the newest one.
Great.
We walk a small group, now I'm talking 8 people, which
Okay.
that's a perfect size. We walk from the front gate and we make our way to the infirmary, and it's called the longest mile, and it replicates what a patient getting here in the 1930s may have experienced. So that's a regular event. I do that on a Friday, usually the last Friday of the month, but I'll do that by special appointment if people contact me. I do regular tours for clubs and students inside of the museum, and I have a touchscreen computer that I've developed, a quiz that I use for students. It's a lot.
that's
Actually,
amazing.
it kind of makes the experience more, I guess, understandable, because it's a huge history. Most people don't think it's a very big history, or they think they know what happened, and it's actually something else.
It is, and it's been so fascinating to sit here and talk to you. So our time has come to an end.
Okay.
I thank you for all of the
very
information about this wonderful place.
Do a web search if you have any questions about our hours, and no
That's
charge
right,
to
folks.
come in. We're closed federal holidays.
That's it. So teachers, this is great for field trips for your kids.
Absolutely.
And Elizabeth, thank you.
You're welcome.